Welcome to the Anglican Centre Rome podcast.
Our guest speaker tonight is a highly respected and much-loved theologian, author and scripture scholar. Dr. Paula Gooder is Canon Chancellor of St Paul's Cathedral and a former member of the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission. She's written very widely on the New Testament, and her novel Phoebe, about which we'll hear this evening, was published in the spring of 2018. We're hugely grateful to Paula for being with us. Rome, as many of you will know, is a city of hidden secrets. One such gem is buried underneath the Palazzo Doria Pamphili, which houses the Anglican Centre in Rome. The small church of Santa Maria in Via Lata has an ancient crypt which is believed to be the site of St Paul's house arrest in Rome as he awaited trial. I first encountered this place with a former director of the Anglican Centre, Archbishop Moxon, and a few colleagues years ago. And whenever I read Paul's letters, either to or from Rome, I think of this deeply holy and special place and allow my mind to imagine what life might have been like for St Paul and those to whom he wrote. This evening, Paula is going to open up this world for us. The title of her talk is In the Footsteps of the Early Roman Christians, Phoebe's Story, and it's now a great delight to hand over to Paula.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Will. And it's absolutely lovely to be here with you all from St Paul's Cathedral, though my background isn't as good as Jamie's. And it's great to be able to talk to you about my book, Phoebe, though I have to confess that it's slightly odd for me because I'm now in the middle of another book, which is called Lydia and based in Philippi. So I've had to pull my brain out of Philippi and put it instead back into Rome. So I will do my best this evening to remember Phoebe and everything that I was talking about there. And I need to begin by mildly disagreeing with Jamie about a description of my book, which he called a novel. And I've been very clear all the way through that it's not a novel, but you'll see why we disagree on this. It is a story. But what I've been trying to argue is that it's not a novel in the sense that I'm not a novelist, I'm a New Testament scholar. And the thing about a novel is driven by its characters and its plot and can go almost anywhere. What I was trying to do in this book was be driven by what we know about Rome and Romans, and particularly about Pauline scholarship. So I was trying to provide an easily digestible insight into various aspects of Pauline scholarship as we went. So therefore, it's not quite a novel. It's not entirely not a novel, but it's not quite a novel. I call it instead an act of historical imagination. What I'm trying to do in the book is to imagine what it might have felt like, what it might have been like to be one of those earliest Roman Christians who heard Romans read out for the first time, probably by Phoebe, who I'll tell you about later on in the talk, and how that might have resonated for people. So what I was attempting to do in the book actually was to reflect a certain strand of modern day Pauline scholarship, which is beginning to help people to try and get into how we engage with the Pauline literature and how we understand it afresh. So, as many of you will know, traditionally the way in which you understand New Testament writings, and especially the writings of Paul, is that you imagine what the author was trying to achieve when they were writing. So we try and think our way into the mind of Paul and say, is this authorial intent? Can we work out what the authorial intent was? And how does that authorial intent help us to understand Romans and the other letters that Paul wrote? There's a modern strand of scholarship which is becoming increasingly interesting in my view, which is looking at another way round of understanding the Pauline letters. It's not discarding the traditional way of understanding the Pauline letters, but adding another strand to it, which is to say, what might it have felt like to have heard the Pauline letters? So not disputing the authorial intent, but asking that kind of receiver intent and what what would people have thought about when they were hearing Romans, Philippians, 1 and 2 Corinthians for the first time? What was their experience? What would have helped them to understand what was going on? And when you get into that kind of scholarship, you begin to get some very, very interesting insights into the letters and what was going on within the letters. For me, one of the really fascinating things to note when you start doing that is that when we think about Pauline scholarship, we all know that we receive Paul's letters in a very different way. So there are people like me who absolutely adore Paul's letters, and will go on about them for ages because we enjoyed them so much. But there will be others, and I'm sure there will be some of you present who fall into that camp, who really can't abide Paul's letters, that you find them hard to understand, opaque, maybe quite irritating. And we recognise actually today that we have all sorts of different responses to Paul's letters. And yet we assume that Paul's original audience all took them in the same way. They all received them with equal enthusiasm. And it's one of those rather intriguing features in the interpretation of Pauline letters, that we do assume that everyone enjoyed Paul's letters in the same kind of way, which always makes me want to say, have you never read 1 and 2 Corinthians? Because it's quite clear from 1 and 2 Corinthians that the Corinthians did not lap up Paul's letters, that they were really quite opposed to some of the things that Paul says. You can tell by reading between the gaps that actually people responded quite negatively to Paul in Corinth. So therefore, that begins to set up for us this possibility that Paul's earliest receivers, the people who first heard Paul writing, responded with as great a variety to Paul's letters as we do today. It therefore challenges us to ask that question, well, what is the kind of variety that they might have responded with? And that is that area of Pauline scholarship that I was just telling you about, where people begin to say, well, what might it have been like? What was the nature of the variety? And there is a particular book that I've been really influenced by. So I'm just looking for it so I can show it to you. It's this one by Peter Oakes, Reading Romans in Pompeii. And it's a very, very interesting book to begin to kickstart your thinking in this particular area. So what Peter Oakes does is that he has a very close examination of the archaeological remains in Pompeii, and has a look at the different kinds of people that would have lived in Pompeii. So the size of the houses, from the large villas all the way through to the very poor tenement buildings, from shopkeepers through to very wealthy people, from those who were slaves all the way through to those who were freed slaves, all the way through to those who were aristocrats, and asks, how would the different people from different strata of society have understood Paul's letters? Now, of course, he's fabricating it because we don't know that anybody in Pompeii ever read Romans. But what he's doing is using the archaeological evidence that we've got from one Roman city that we do know about, and wondering what it might look like if we read Romans in that kind of way. And when I was reading his book, was incredibly influenced by his vision of how we might understand the Christians of the first century, and how therefore we might understand how those Christians then understood Paul's letters. So if you read my book, Phoebe, one of the things that you will notice about the book is that Paul never appears, and he never appears on purpose. Because what I'm trying to do is present in the book all the different kinds of people who encountered Paul through his letters and possibly in real life, and to represent their reactions to you rather than Paul himself. So we have Jews who respond to Paul, and we have Greeks who respond to Paul. We have those from the elite parts of society. We have slaves. We have people who are really struggling for money, who are neither elite nor slaves. We have people who come from Rome, people who come from outside of Rome, and trying to imagine how all of those different people responded in different ways. And the reason why I think that's very interesting is it begins to give life to Paul's letters. It lifts them off the page and gives you a little bit more of a sense of a story, of actual people, of encounters that you might have with people who encountered those early letters of Paul. And the other thing it does, which is very interesting, is that it gives us some kind of backdrop against which to understand the letters. One of the challenges we find when we're reading Paul's letters, as you will all know, is that one of the really frustrating features is that it's like listening to one side of a telephone call. You've got Paul's voice and nobody else's voice. What you have to try and do is extrapolate the other people's voices. But actually, although we don't know very much about the historical background of Paul himself in this particular instance, so we can't even agree on the exact date of the writing of Romans. It's sometime in the mid to late 50s. But there's lots of different views. Some think he was closer to the mid 50s. Some people think he was closer to the late 50s. And any of you who know anything about New Testament scholars, we all fight equally vehemently for the date we've gone for. But we don't really know very much about it, other than that it falls within that gap, probably somewhere between 55 and 58 AD. But what we do know a lot about is first century Rome, because we have all sorts of additional external information about first century Rome from a whole range of different Roman sources. We have it from archaeological finds, we have it from early writers in the first century. So we can actually understand a lot more about first century Rome than we can about Paul's own history. And it therefore is really, really interesting to play what we know about first century Rome onto Paul's writings and to understand various things about it. So what I'm going to do now is to go on and tell you a little bit about what we do know about first century Rome, before I then go on to tell you what we do know about Phoebe, to give you a sense of what's going on in the book. So the first thing to bear in mind, which I think is crucially important for understanding Romans, is that whenever you think Romans was written, whether you go for the earlier closer to 55 date or whether you go for the later closer to 58 date, it was in the reign of Nero. Nero, as you will probably know, came to power in 54 AD. So therefore, what we have in the context of Romans is that Romans is set against the reign of Nero. Now, again, as many of you will know, one of the really important things about Nero's reign is that it is only by the time you get to 62 AD and onwards that the Nero that you will know, the Nero who persecuted Christians, the Nero who attributed the fire of Rome to the Christians, really comes to the fore. Early in Nero's reign, he was regarded as almost a saviour. After all sorts of things having gone wrong in Claudius's reign, Nero was the new great hope for the Roman Empire. And therefore he came to power on a great wave of optimism. As we all know, he did not end his time in power on a wave of optimism, but he certainly came with a great wave of optimism. Other than the odd note of Nero and his sycophants roaming the streets looking for sexual services, in the earliest years, Nero was regarded as a great ruler. And so it's quite interesting to be able to place the letter of Romans against this early reign of Nero, when actually the Roman Empire was looking hopeful, when everything was looking up. As I've said, as we all know, it started to look down again by the time you get into the mid-60s. But certainly at this earlier period, it was a great hopeful era. The other things that we can know from first century Rome, which I think are absolutely fascinating, is that there is a study by somebody called Peter Lamp, who has had a look at where Christians can be located in first century Rome. And you may be thinking, how could we possibly know where the earliest Christians were located? Well, Lamp has done some absolutely fascinating surveys of archaeology and inscriptions and has concluded that the vast majority of Christians in first century Rome lived in what we would now call Trastevere, what they then called Trans-Tiberium, just across the Tiber, And one of the theories about why Nero blamed the Christians so much for the fire of Rome is Trastevere is a marshland. And therefore, if the majority of earliest Christians lived in marshland, their houses wouldn't have burnt down in the Great Fire in the way that the rest of Rome did. And so therefore, one of the sources of blame, apart from all the others, but one of the sources of blame were possibly that these early Christians had survived the fire in the way that other early Romans had not. And therefore, these kinds of archaeological discoveries, these kinds of inscriptions, these kinds of writings about first century Rome give us some really very interesting insights into the kinds of people who would have received Paul's letters. It's also quite interesting to imagine how many Christians there might have been to receive Paul's letter of the Romans. And this is where scholars absolutely do not agree at all. So at the most conservative end, you have a thought that there might have been in the region of about 100 Christians in Rome at the time of the letter of the Romans. At the most extravagant end, there's a theory that there were about 3,000 Christians in Rome at this period, and all sorts of opinions in between 100 and 3,000. But you get that sense that there were either quite a lot or a huge number, depending on how you kind of structure this. And the reason why that becomes important is the question of how the communities in Rome related to each other. And this question of the communities in Rome relating is quite important. So one of the things that we know is that the earliest Christians gathered together in small communities, and in this early period, in the buildings that they could find. Again, Eddie Adams has written a very important study which reveals to us that our assumptions that all Christians worshipped in villas in the early period is completely wrong. We've all imagined that Roman villa. If you know about a Roman villa, you'll know that there's a shop front on the front, then it goes through into an atrium, then you have further public rooms and then private rooms towards the back. And so for much of the 20th century, scholars tried to imagine how many people you could get into a Roman villa of that kind of size, which is one of those slightly entertaining scholarly exercises. It's how many people can you get into a phone box extrapolated into the first century. And again, people kind of had all sorts of ideas of people between the number of 30 all the way through to about 150 people that you could get into a villa. But as Eddie Adams has revealed, actually, it is highly unlikely that the vast majority of Christians did worship together in villas. It's much more likely that there was a wide range of different buildings that people worshipped in, whether they be the villas of the wealthy, because the problem, of course, is only the wealthiest people would have lived in a villa in this period, through to tenement blocks and the small rooms that people had available to them in tenement blocks, which would have made the number of people worshipping much, much smaller together, probably 10 or so. You would also have had people gathering together in workshops and in shops, in other kinds of public buildings. And therefore, what that reveals to us is that the Christian community across Rome, whether you go with 100 or 3,000, gathered together in different areas, different communities. And therefore, when Paul is writing to Roman Christians, he is writing to communities across the city of Rome. The majority may have been in the Trastevere region, but there may have been others all through Rome. And then we have to try and imagine, therefore, how those smaller communities of Christians gathering together communicated with each other. Could they all gather together in the same place? How did they get copies of the letter to the Romans? Those kinds of questions become particularly interesting. And then we get on to particular themes that people who lived in Rome might have been particularly interested in. And I just want to draw your attention to two in particular, which you will know are very significant within Romans, because I think they give you an added resonance to understanding Romans. And I'm talking here particularly about Romans 8 and the theme both about slavery and about adoption that comes through very, very clearly in Romans 8. One of the things that Romans would have known is that adoption was incredibly common in the Roman Empire. But what adoption meant in the Roman Empire was actually very different to what adoption means to us today. It was most common in the Roman Empire to adopt a grown-up male. It was always a male, it was always a male, but they were normally grown-ups. And the reason why they did that was that if somebody had survived through to adulthood, you could be more guaranteed that your inheritance would be passed on into safe hands. And interestingly, if you're interested in this at all, just have a look at the Roman emperors who reigned in the 1st century and note how many of them were adopted. It is absolutely fascinating to notice how many Roman emperors were actually adopted by their fathers. The example of the one that we've already talked about is Emperor Nero, who was adopted by Claudius. So if you know that adoption as an adult is a very common theme, then recognizing that in Romans 8, the theme of adoption so that you can inherit, becomes a very, very resonant theme. The other thing to note is that within the Roman Empire, it was not impossible. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was common, but it was not impossible for slaves in a single move to go from being a slave to being the adopted son. There are more than one, there are quite a few examples of people doing that. So that whole language of slavery and children and adoption and inheritance suddenly gets an added resonance when you recognize Romans 8. They were talking against a background that Romans would have understood, they would have related to. So you get that sense, therefore, that actually people living in Rome had certain themes that played for them, that made sense to them. So when Paul was writing Romans, these themes emerged and began to resonate with the people who were listening. And that is why it's really interesting to imagine who might have been listening to Paul's letter to the Romans. Which gets us to the question of who might have been listening to Paul's letter to the Romans. And one of the things that happens when you read Romans, if you are somebody who does read Romans, is that by the time you've got through to the end of Romans 15, you have ploughed through such complex theology, you breathe a sigh of relief and say, thank goodness for that. I can now close the epistle and reflect on what I've read. And a lot of people forget to read all the way through to the end of Romans 16. I would argue that the most interesting chapter in the whole of Romans is Romans 16. And the reason why is because of all the names that you have. Paul says hello to a large range of people at the end of the letter in Romans 16. And just looking at the names that Paul cites gets you into some very, very interesting insights. So you have a large number of women, you have Latin sounding names, you have Greek sounding names, you have Jewish, clearly Jewish names. You have references to people who meet in certain people's houses. There are at least 5 different communities referred to in Romans 16 as different people who met together in different houses. So therefore, Paul is clearly writing to more than one community, not just to a single community. If you are minded to become a little bit obsessed about detail, which I have a tendency to, you can get absolutely lost in Romans 16. Which leads me on to suggest, to recommend another book to you if you're interested in this at all. It's a book by Scott McKnight, and it's called Reading Romans Backwards. And unfortunately for me, as often happens in these situations, Scott McKnight's book came out after I had published Phoebe, so I wasn't able to enjoy it while I was writing the book. I was nevertheless able to enjoy it after I'd written the book. And what Scott McKnight does is he reads Romans through the lens of Romans 16. And I commend it to you highly. It's an absolutely fascinating attempt to do a very similar thing to what I was trying to do in my book, but just doing it in a slightly different way. So therefore, what you get is this sense of a wide variety, a kind of a large spread of ethnicities, a large spread of backgrounds, a large spread of wealth. You can tell from the names written used that there are both wealthy people and slaves. There are people who are clearly quite poor, as well as people who are clearly clearly quite wealthy, all mentioned at the end of Romans 16. So again, you get this vivid, quite kind of vibrant picture of what the Roman church was like. So that leads me at last to talk to you about Phoebe, and I will do so briefly, and then we can talk to her a little bit more. I'll talk about her more as we get into the questions. Phoebe has fascinated me for years and years and years. And one of the reasons why she has fascinated me is you always get to the commentators' notes on Romans 16, verses 1 to 2. And then the commentators say a whole range of utterly fascinating things about Phoebe. And then they move on to Romans 16, verse 3. And you want to say, stop. You just said 5 utterly fascinating things, and now you're just going to leave them there hanging. And let me tell you what the 5 fascinating things are, because I think they're really intriguing. The first fascinating thing, which is the thing you probably will all know about Phoebe, is that Paul says she's a deacon of the church in Cenchreae. So 2 things to explain there. The first is the word Cenchreae. In case you don't know, Cenchreae is one of the seaports of Corinth. So we know that Phoebe has come from Corinth. It therefore helps us to locate the background of Romans, because it suggests that Phoebe was in Corinth with Paul. Therefore, Paul was in Corinth while writing Romans, then gave Phoebe the letter to take to Rome. So she was in Corinth, and she is a deacon of the church in Cenchreae. The way in which that phrase works indicates that both the people in the church of Cenchreae and the people in the church of Rome knew what Paul meant when he said Phoebe is a deacon of the church in Cenchreae. Unfortunately, they may have known what a deacon in the church of Cenchreae meant. We don't know what a deacon in the church of Cenchreae meant. We can guess. We can extrapolate from other things that we know, but all we can know is that it was sufficient of a label for the Roman Christians to go, oh, a deacon, excellent. And the trouble is that we don't know precisely what it meant in that particular context. But she had some kind of role in the church of Corinth, one that was sufficiently recognizable for the Roman Christians to recognize it. First interesting fact. The second interesting fact is that she is commended by Paul. So Paul uses the language in Romans 16, verse 1, I commend to you our sister Phoebe. That Greek word is the word that you would use within Greek, any letter written in Greek. If you were saying to the people who were receiving the letter, treat this person as though they are me. I mean, it's not just a word that says, this is a nice person, be nice to her. It's a word that says, this is my ambassador. This is somebody that you are to treat as though they were me in your presence. Therefore, it is kind of quite a high word, and it has quite a high value to it, and therefore makes us realize that Paul is saying to the Roman community, you may treat Phoebe as though she is me, myself. And the reason why that becomes fascinating in this particular context is that my third point about why Phoebe is interesting, that therefore suggests that Phoebe was the person who took the letter of Romans from Corinth to Rome. The language suggests that she was the bearer of the letter. And the vast majority of New Testament scholars, and by that I mean 90% of New Testament scholars, and this is unusual for those of you who know New Testament scholars, all agree that therefore it makes it most likely that Phoebe was the first exegete of Romans. In the unlikely event, I'm sure you all have in your minds, that the earliest Christians who first heard Romans didn't understand absolutely all of it, they would then, after the letter had been read out, might have said to Phoebe, now, Romans 5, can you please explain that to us? Although, of course, it wasn't Romans 5 in those days, but that chapter, can you explain it to us? And Phoebe would have gone on to explain what it meant. So I'm sure those of you who know me will know that it causes me a particular moment of enjoyment that Romans, which is largely today exegeted by men because Pauline scholarship is dominated by male scholars, that the very first exegete of Romans is most likely a woman. It's just rather a pleasing little bit of detail. So we've got that Phoebe comes from Cenchreae and was a deacon, that she's commended to the Roman Church by Paul, that she was probably the first exegete of Romans. Then we have the fourth interesting fact about Phoebe, that according to the NRSV translation, she has been a benefactor of many. That word is differently translated in different translations, from those who say that she is a helper, through to the NRSV that says she's a benefactor, through to others, which I think is a better translation, that says that Phoebe was a patron of many. The Greek word prostatis means somebody who had a patron-client relationship with people. Those of you who know anything about the Roman culture will know that the patron-client relationship was one of the crucial features of Roman culture. So what would happen is that those who had money, those who were wealthy, would have clients who they looked after. In the morning, the clients would line up outside the household, and the clients would then ask their patron for help. And the patron would commission them to do all sorts of things, whether it was going down to the market to buy oranges for them, or making them a sculpture, or writing them a poem. Any of you who might have read, sorry, his name's gone, Catullus, when you were at school, will know that Catullus had a patron, and Catullus's poetry was entirely commissioned by a patron. That's the word that we're looking at here. So it suggests that Phoebe is not only a recognized character in the Church of Cenchreae, but also somebody who is wealthy. Somebody who is wealthy enough to come to Rome and do what Paul wants her to. And you will notice that there's a lovely little phrase here. I ask you to help her in whatever she may require from you, which suggests that she's come to do something. Paul doesn't tell us what it is, but she's come to do something. And Paul is saying, this person is important in Corinth. She has been a wealthy patron of many people. Can you help her out? Which brings me to my final interesting piece of information about Phoebe, which is that, again, people largely agree that the name Phoebe is a slave name. It's not normally used of freed people. It's normally used of slaves, which therefore suggests that Phoebe is a freed slave. If you put together those 5 pieces of information, I hope you will agree, those are 5 fascinating pieces of information, and just are tantalizing in asking us to imagine who this person might have been, what she was doing coming to Rome. And I felt, after many, many years of thinking about it, that really the only thing to do was to let my imagination rip, which is what I did in writing the book Phoebe, to say, here we have 5 fascinating pieces of information. We also have a wealth of utterly interesting information from archaeology, from inscriptions, from contemporaneous writings in the Roman world. Put them together and you can end up with something really, really interesting. So I fascinated myself in writing Phoebe, and I'm pleased that a couple of other people have enjoyed it as well. So that's why I wrote it. That's what I was trying to do. I think that's probably a good moment for me to pause, and we can then have a further conversation about this mode of interpretation. You're very welcome to disagree with me about anything that I've said, and we could just have a conversation and see where we can take it.
Thank you for listening to the Anglican Centre Rome podcast.